It was around midnight in a small town in upstate New York. 27-year-old Bethany Mayers had just finished her shift at work. She said goodnight to her boss and began to walk back to her home. Walking home, she kept a straight, bored look on her face. This was due to the fact that she was exhausted from her job. She worked as a small-time graphic designer, so the pay was decent enough to afford a small house. Bethany sighed and continued walking home. She noticed the night was colder than usual as she began to shiver a bit. But she then told herself that it was the middle of October and the clothes she was wearing were not really meant for cold weather. She was wearing short pants with a white sleeve shirt that she had bought at Walmart for at least $9. She continued walking down the narrow sidewalk until she could start to see her house coming into view. Bethany then stopped at the sound of a noise. She wasn't easily startled, but it was probably due to the silence of the night. She didn't live in a very busy neighborhood, and not many cars passed by, so abrupt noises weren't common. Bethany herself didn't own a car due to the fact that she didn't need one, as her job was quite close to where she lived. She just turned around to see what the noise was out of curiosity. She found out what it was: a raccoon digging in the trash. She laughed a little bit to herself because she thought that it was a bit cute and continued walking. She finally reached her house. Checking her watch almost randomly, she saw it was around 12:20 a.m. Yawning a bit, she opened the door to her house and closed it, locking it behind her. Bethany prepared herself some coffee with a new coffee maker she had been given as a gift by one of her colleagues at work. I think they brought it from Sears, but can't be sure. Letting the coffee heat up, she went into the living room and sat on her couch to watch a bit of late-night television. A little TV might keep me awake, she said to herself, yawning loudly. She began to aimlessly flip through channels with her remote, occasionally staying on one channel longer. If it sparked her interest, she might finally settle on CNN to catch up on the news. Making herself comfortable, she continued to watch TV as she waited for the coffee to be ready. As it cut to commercial, she heard a loud thump behind her. Forcing herself to move, she got up to see what it was. Worried that something might have fallen, there was nothing. I'm starting to freak myself out, she whispered to herself. Behind her sofa was a small dark hallway leading to her room. She peered down the hallway, hesitantly to see what may have caused the noise. Nothing but a dark hallway, but as she began to turn around, she saw something that made her freeze in place. In the corner of the darkness, she saw something blink, like two pair of eyes in the dark. She began to feel uneasy. Trying to make herself move, the coffee began to steam, snapping Bethany back to reality. She ran to the kitchen to turn off the coffee maker. She sighed, thinking she was going crazy. She then gets a cup and began to pour the coffee, and then taking a sip of it, the warm feeling in her mouth easing her tension a bit, though she wasn't completely convinced she was imagining things. She could barely see through the dark, but she swore to herself that she saw two eyes blink. Bethany begins to walk back to the living room and rest on the couch, her sleep deprivation making her yawn again. She continued to quietly watch the TV while occasionally glancing behind her out of silent paranoia. Bethany slapped herself for being this scared over nothing. She turned back to the news where the anchorman is on. I can't I can never remember his name. She then begins to squint as the TV begins to slightly distort and twist. Bethany stares as it quietly and silently disorients, wondering what the hell is going on. The audio of the TV began to become distorted as well, making the people on it incomprehensible. That feeling of fear slowly begins to come back to her. As she began to hear something in the dark, silent muttering, she listened but couldn't make out any words, just guttural whispers that sounded like a young boy. Bethany begins to shudder uncontrollably, coming to the conclusion that there is someone in her house. She slowly begins to get up off the couch, a small creak coming from her steps while making her way to the hallway. Squinting and still a bit disoriented, her eyes begins to slowly adjust to the darkness. She briefly wondered why she didn't turn on the light. But those thoughts are interrupted by the muttering, now sounding like small whispers. As she moved to her oak-made door, thoughts poured into her head. Who was this? How were they in her house? And most importantly, what did they want? She reached her door and knelt, listening to the muttering from inside. She could hear it more clearly. The voice sounded like a young child. It muttered small guttural words to itself, things she couldn't understand. Then the door opened slightly, the oak making a creaking noise. She froze, knowing the person in her house was right next to the door. Hesitantly, she peered through the creak, trying to see something. There was nothing. It was at this moment she heard the whisper in her ear. She turned around swiftly to see an eye staring at her through the door crack by the hinges. She looked at it petrified as it continued to whisper. The eyes were not normal. The scarlet was jet black like a negative image, and the iris was a crimson red. Bethany slowly began to back away, as the eyes continued to stare at her, wide and wild. In a flash, she slammed the door, hearing a small scream. As she bolted for the front door, she could hear the screaming getting louder. Her white shirt was now drenched in sweat. She reached the door, struggling to open it, but at that moment remembered that it was locked. However, these thoughts only lasted a second as she saw the horrifying image of a figure running at her wide-eyed and screaming with an axe in hand. She screamed at the sight only to be silenced a second later. The figure brought the axe down on her head in mid-scream, splitting her skull. Bethany slowly began to twitch and spasm, blood starting to pour from the top of her head along with chunks of bone and flesh. The figure then arched back, removing the thick blade from her head. She fell to the floor, her head making a sickening crack due to the broken skull. The figure glared at the body, smiling, noticing the body still twitching. He then wiped his hands and threw the axe he had stolen from a hardware store yesterday on the ground, knowing no fingerprints would be found. He wiped some blood on his long black sleeve. Then, remembering blood cannot be seen on a black shirt, sighing, he bent down to the body. While taking a small knife from his pocket, he began to cut out her twitching eye, leaving two black sockets. Seeing his work finally done, he went to the living room, turning off the TV out of courtesy, and left through the front door, his attire a bit more suited for the cold weather, consisting of faded jeans and black long sleeves.
It was a fun night. I only wish she had a better taste in clothes.